I want to talk to you guys about Viktor Orban, the EU, and a potential nuclear option that the European Union still has on the table in Article 7 that they could trigger if Viktor Orban continues to block the $55 billion in financial assistance to keep the country afloat. So first off, I want to tell you guys the background between this conflict. So the vast majority of EU states support aid to Ukraine. The vast majority of voters and residents within the EU support aid to Ukraine. The vast majority of the political institutions in the EU support aid to Ukraine. The EU itself, NATO supports Ukraine. Europe as a whole broadly supports Ukraine. Now, this isn't true for everyone, though. There are a few countries where that support either somewhat falters or completely falls through. Slovakia is one example, and we're going to get back to Slovakia later. Slovakia recently had elections where somebody who is explicitly against aid to Ukraine and made a promise on the campaign trail to stop aid to Ukraine won the recent Slovak elections. Now, the reason he won the Slovak elections isn't because he came out against aid to Ukraine. It wasn't the #1 topic during the campaign, but that does show that it's not everywhere, that the support for Ukraine is overwhelming. Some countries support Ukraine much more than others, while a few countries don't support Ukraine really much at all. This is the case for Austria, for example, which has done very little to support Ukraine. But on the other end, there is a country, on the other end of supporting Ukraine, there is one country that has constantly been tripping Ukraine up ever since the process of EU integration with the Ukrainians started. And this isn't only EU integration, but also the idea of NATO integration. But NATO integration, it's been less involved because the topic has come up less, because NATO is not currently pursuing Ukraine being part of NATO before the end of the war. But the EU integration process, the EU accession process is on its way. And so Hungary, the country in question, has been making a lot of noise around that and around issues concerning EU aid to Ukraine. So there was a $55 billion aid package proposed by the EU for Ukraine and financial assistance going up to 2027. This would help in a bunch of different things, including help teachers pay their salaries, help with administrative costs, and help the Ukrainian state stay afloat during a time of war when it's facing financial pressures from many different directions, but primarily from, of course, the east, from the Russian invasion. Now, 27 EU countries are in favor of it. 27. The support for this is overwhelming. There was no country that was explicitly against it outside of the Hungarians. Now, the Hungarians, it almost feels like, have been scrambling for reasons to oppose advancing Ukrainian interests in the EU and in Europe broadly. I think the most obvious example of this was during the EU accession process. The Hungarians said, well, I don't really know about this whole Ukraine joining the EU thing. The Hungarian community in Ukraine, the 80,000 strong Hungarian community in Ukraine, has been getting a rough hand lately. They have to teach the majority of their lessons in Ukrainian in school according to Ukrainian law. Until stuff like that is addressed, then we can't really decide anything on Ukrainian membership in the EU. And so what did Ukraine do? They went with the recommendations of the Venice Commission, changed their laws, and then the Hungarian community's leaders started coming up and writing letters, group letters all together, to the Hungarian government, telling them to stop blocking the accession process because the Ukrainian government had altered the laws and had satisfied most of their demands, satisfied most of their concerns. And then when Volodymyr Zelensky had an opportunity to talk to Viktor Orban when he was in Argentina with Viktor Orban after the new ANCAP president came into power, and he was asking him, hey, we addressed this, we address your concerns. The EU Commission is saying that we've gone through 90% of the process, 90% of the changes in regulations and administration in order to join the EU. Why are you going to block our ascension? The Ukrainians are adamant that in the discussion that happened in Argentina, Viktor Orban could not come up with a decent objection, could not come up with a reason to continue to stop the process. And up till Viktor Orban eventually stepped out of the meeting at the recommendation of Olaf Scholz, which was Olaf Scholz's recommendation, was for Viktor Orban to step out of the meeting when they were holding the vote on Ukrainian EU ascension, or at least starting the talks about Ukrainian ascension into the EU. He suggested step out of the room if you can't vote in favor of it, and then you can abstain, go get a coffee. And that's what he did. And up until the moment that that happened, we didn't know if he was going to fall back on the ascension. And Viktor Orban was quick to let everybody know that even though that they stepped out of the room and let it happen, that he was still against Ukrainian membership of NATO. And not only was he against Ukrainian membership of NATO, but that there would be 75 points in the future during the ascension process where the Hungarians could block Ukrainian membership into NATO. Now, in this process of going back and forth with the Hungarians, there was the 55 billion also being debated back and forth. So it wasn't just Ukraine joining the EU, it was also the 55 billion in aid that Ukraine needs to sustain. And so while the Hungarians gave the Ukrainians a victory and allowing the ascension process to essentially begin, not only for the Ukrainians, but also for the Moldovans as well, and I know the Georgians got a small victory too. And while they did deliver that, they did not deliver on the 55 billion and blocked it. Now, some did not know if they were going to block it or not. $10 billion of EU assistance to the Hungarians was unblocked by the EU courts after it had come to a conclusion that judicial reforms in Hungary had been sufficient enough to allow the unfreezing of funds, because they were now in compliance with EU laws and regulations when it comes to the judicial system, and that judicial reforms were concrete enough to permit them to unfreeze those funds. And people were saying, well, maybe those freezing of 10 million of the 10 billion would be enough to juice up the government to, let it through. And the EU was very quick to deny that the reason why this $10 billion of frozen funds to the Hungarians were unfrozen was to grease the wheels, because the EU wants to do anything but start a process of like, hey, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, diplomacy in order to get the Hungarians in line here, because then they feel like they're having their national security priorities held hostage in return for aid. And so the EU was very quick to emphasize that the 10 billion unfrozen was an independent court decision and was not at all related to recent negotiations for EU accession talks or the 55 billion. But that did not stop the Hungarian government from seeing the 10 billion unfrozen, looking at the 22 billion that is still frozen due to Hungarian violations of laws when it comes to law and order, checks and balances, and EU regulations, because Viktor Orban has stuck his nose up at Brussels and the EU and I guess you could say federal Europe broadly, quite often. Hungary then responded to the 10 billion being released by having its foreign minister coming out and basically hinting that, you know what, if you unfreeze the last $22 billion of EU funds that were supposed to go to Hungary but were frozen after Hungary started violating EU laws and regulations, then we'll allow the $55 billion in aid to Ukraine to go through. So it's a little bit of, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. People have said that this is mafia-style diplomacy, that this is rent-seeking behavior from the Hungarians, where they're holding European national security priorities. And when I say European national security priorities, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, these are all countries that national security is directly threatened. EU member states, by what's going on right now in Ukraine and Russia's goals after the war in Ukraine, at least according to Vladimir Putin and the imperial aspirations. Their national security aspirations are being put up for ransom so that Viktor Orban can get around the rules and safety regulations around press freedoms and around a whole bunch of things. He can get around that and get the $22 billion despite his country's lack of adherence to EU laws and regulations. And that's why people are saying this is mafia-style behavior. But some people scared that the aid is not going to get to Ukraine in time, and seeing the $61.5 billion in Ukraine aid frozen in the United States, and seeing the $300 billion in Russian assets still frozen, none of them tapped yet to support Ukraine. And with the American government coming out with statements like, hey guys, we're going to run out of aid by the end of the month. Once January 1st comes around, we're outsy. We're done. We've got nothing left unless we start depleting U.S. stockpiles with no replacements, which of course is going to come with both political and security risks for the Biden administration if to pursue that path. These things ultimately do cost money. And so with all that happening, some people have said, you know what? This is mafia style behavior. This is rent-seeking behavior. Viktor Orban is engaging in the same tactics that Kim Jong-un regimes does in order to try to get aid and aid money inflows. But it's a priority. Maybe we should give them the money. Maybe we should do it anyway. My counterance to that would be, if we engage with this type of rent-seeking behavior here, we have no guarantee that it's not going to stop in the future. Number one, let's say that we give them the money here. And I say we as in, you know, the coalition that supports Ukraine. But let's say the Europeans give them the money, which, by the way, they can't even do. But let's say they do that. Let's say that they just gave him the money. They unfreeze all the money in order to get the aid to Ukraine. How is this going to stop Viktor Orban from just continuing to do this again and again and again, at any of the 75 points of failure during the accession process when it comes to the EU? What's going to stop him from doing something like this of a similar vein again next time an aid package comes up for Ukraine? And it might not be a financial support package, it'll be a weapons package. Then what? Are we just going to have to give Viktor Orban billions upon billions of dollars every single time anyone in the EU wants to protect their national security interests from Russian encroachment? Is that what it's going to be? Not only is that wasteful, not only is that not fair, but it also degrades the credibility of Brussels, the EU, and federal Europe altogether, saying that our rules, institutions, and regulations don't matter, that as long as you vote the way we want you to vote, since we need unanimity, we need unanimous support for these types of initiatives, we're willing to buy your votes. And we don't want to incentivize that type of, again, rent-seeking behavior. Not only does it put European national security interests at risk, and I know that word is a buzzword, but we're talking about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania here. It is real and an ever-present danger for them. It is a real danger for them. Same thing for Moldova. They already have 1,500 troops illegally stationed there. Not only is it a real, tangible, present, at their doorstep, national security interests for these people to have a defense against the Russians and try to get Ukraine what it needs so they don't have to go to them next, or they don't go to their countries next. Not only is it a national security interest for them, but again, the credibility of federalized Europe, the credibility of the European Union's rules, the credibility of the EU courts, and the credibility of these regulations are at risk. And if we subdue these rules and subdue these regulations and subdue the courts to pay Orban his due when he has not come within the rules and the bounds and the laws that have been put forward by the EU Commission, that have been put forward by federal Europe, then it's just going to encourage more behavior like this in the future. And it's going to weaken the European Union that Ukraine is fighting so hard to join. Part of the reason why so many Ukrainian activists want Ukraine to join the EU is because they know that the regulations on corruption are going to be more aggressive than currently exists on the books in Ukraine. They know that certain regulations when it comes to the economy, certain regulations when it comes to labor laws, when it comes to visa-free travel, that there's so many different things that are going to give Ukraine more opportunities, and that the EU can help hold the Ukrainian government to a standard a certain standard in Europe, a certain red line, so they don't become too corrupt, so they don't abuse the people too much. What's the point of all this fighting for that European path, that European destiny, that European future, if all of the things that are being fought for, all the values of equal treatment, fair treatment, are being thrown out in the process? If we're like, okay, but we can look across, we can disregard press freedom here, we can disregard, corruption here, we can disregard this here. The reason why Ukraine wants to join the European Union is because of these standards, because these standards exist. Because these standards exist, because they want to be part of the common market. But if there's going to be a common market, there also needs to be common rules. And the Hungarians need to play by those rules. So, what can we do? What options do we have left? Well, there is one option left, even if we don't have unanimous support and the Hungarians are blocking it. It is possible to remove Hungary's voting power. It is possible to make it so the Hungarians can no longer veto the $55 billion in aid to Ukraine because they won't have the power to vote against it. And the thing that would allow the European Union to do this would be Article 7. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Article 5. Article 5, collective defense. If one country is attacked, the rest of them attacked. Article 7 is something completely different. What Article 7 says is that if a country is in violation of EU laws and regulations, for example, if a country was to cancel elections and declare a dictatorship, for example, then the EU can not only block funds and block aid, they can also suspend their voting membership, their ability to vote at the EU, vote at the EU Council, vote in Brussels. And if that voting power is removed from Hungary, then they'll be able to get the aid through. And Hungary has been violating rules and regulations when it comes to the European Union. The whole reason why these assets are frozen in the first place is because they wanted to violate, is because they violated laws and regulations that the EU stands by, that the EU has put forward, that everybody else has to uphold. So if this vote is suspended, one second, Orban gets upset with him being silenced, then maybe he could just, I don't know, okay, gotcha. So if Orban's vote is dragged back from this Article 7 citing, or this Article 7 calling, this is the nuclear option. There's a reason why the EU is held back, is because this is not used often, and this is only used, or is only supposed to be used, when the country in question is violating EU laws and regulations. It isolates them. It greatly isolates the country in question. And so if they're going to throw Hungary into that level of isolation, if they're going to take away their right to their ability to vote because of the violation of the rules, they should have a good reason to do it. And I'm not saying that we should call Article 7 just because they're violating the rules. I think it should be called because they're violating the rules and they're trying to leverage European security in order to get around violating the rules and get aid while violating the rules. They're engaging in rent-seeking behavior. They're holding the money for Ukraine hostage when the rest of Europe supports it. And they're doing it all while leveraging it against rules that they already violated and regulations that they already violated in Europe. So if they're going to leverage European security interests, and when I say security interests, again, I mean stuff at their doorstep. If they're going to leverage Europe's security in order to get around the rules and regulations of the EU and to unfreeze funds and aid that was frozen because they broke the rules, and instead of not breaking the rules, they want to keep breaking the rules, but get around the rules and leverage the security of Europe to do so, yes, I think that shows enough malice and cynicism in their behavior and the leveraging of Europe's security, which is not something you want to encourage. And so if this option's on the table and it would work, I think that it would be worth triggering if the Hungarians cannot be reasoned with. Now, The reason why this hasn't been triggered before is because up until recently, up until Donald Tusk's government, the new Polish government that kicked out the Law and Justice Party coalition from power, this is a more liberal centrist coalition, pro-EU, pro-European federalization, Donald Tusk's government, in comparison to the Law and Justice Party, which has been more confrontational and has historically came out and supported Viktor Orban's government against the EU when he was standing up against, quote unquote, standing up against their regulations. But Donald Tusk has worked a lot with EU integration and is very, very pro-EU and very, very pro-Ukraine. So now the Law and Justice Party in the Polish government isn't going to back up Viktor Orban. And he needed that backup because the only thing stopping Article 7 from being called is not only the social taboo of using the nuclear option, it's also it has to be a unanimous vote from the rest of the states in the EU to suspend somebody's voting rights. And so since Poland was backing up Viktor Orban and Viktor Orban was backing up Poland during the last government, they could support each other from that scenario. But now that Law and Justice Party is gone, it's an open question whether anybody else would come out to support Viktor Orban if Article 7 was called. Now, this is where Slovakia comes in, and this is where this is gonna spell the one kind of wrench in this plan that could upset Article 7 being called. Even if it would at least, even if it failed, it would still show the extremeness of the situation. You can emphasize the extremeness, but it would still fail if one country was to say, nah, I'm not with that. And that country might be Slovakia. Slovakia has a new government. That government is anti-aid to Ukraine. That government does not support sending more munitions and more aid to Ukraine. And that government did have well wishes for Viktor Orban, and Viktor Orban did have well wishes for the government when it came into power. And so there is a possibility that even if the Law and Justice Party is no longer there to support Viktor Orban in an Article 7 scenario, the Slovaks could be. But we don't know that for yet. That's all hypothetical. So if that would be the case, then I can understand, if they already know that in advance, why they wouldn't call Article 7. But the fact that they're discussing it, and we know that European officials are recommending in closed-door meetings, or at least talking about in closed-door meetings, Article 7 suspension of Hungary's right to vote when it comes to EU regulations, EU policies, and EU laws, I think it does show that it might have at least some promise. And if it has promise, then it should be pursued. The Hungarians have more than earned it through their behavior. I will also say, lastly, and I do think this is important to mention, that the EU has said that whether or not the 55 billion are approved through the EU, that they're going to get the money to Ukraine. That there's still bilateral ways to get money to Ukraine. That means instead of it being a big bundle that all the EU countries brought together, each EU country does it themselves. So instead of like big fund, it'll be UK gives 1 billion, Norway gives 2 billion, Denmark gives 1 billion. So they still can get unilateral aid, and they can try to create some structure outside of the EU or outside of something that requires a unanimous vote in order to get aid to Ukraine. But that would be outside of the structure of the EU, when the strategy to win, the strategy for Ukraine to get victory, has to be long-term support from the European Union, from its allies, that shows that that support isn't going anywhere, so the Russians can't just wait them out, which seems to be the current strategy if you listen to people like Sergei Shoigu, who says that the Russians have to fight up until at least 2025. Why is 2025 important? 2024 presidential elections.